Richard Taylor stands alone in his workshop, the neighborhood gatherings chatter still echoing in his ears. His wife's words, "worst in bed ever," hang in the air like poison. Fingers trembling, he opens the drawer where 35 years of marriage photos hide. The polished oak feels cool against his palm as sawdust mingles with the scent of his aftershave. The single lamp casts long shadows across meticulously arranged tools, each representing decades of careful precision now mocked by casual cruelty. A tear splashes onto their wedding photo, blurring younger faces full of promise. Have you ever felt the sting of public humiliation from someone who should protect your dignity? Share your experience below, like if this resonates with your marriage, and follow to discover how wisdom can triumph over humiliation. Richard's shoulders shake with silent sobs, pride intact only in solitude, as the faint sound of a neighbor's approach freezes him mid-breath. Who stands outside his sanctuary? Richard Taylor stood alone in his workshop, the neighborhood gathering's voices still echoing in his ears. His wife's words, "worst in bed ever," hung in the air like poison. The single lamp cast long shadows across his workbench, tools arranged with the same precision he'd applied to 35 years of marriage counseling, and now 35 years of marriage. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He swiped at his eyes, composing his face before opening the door a crack. Elena stood there, the neighborhood's recent widow, concern etched in her features. "I'm sorry about what happened," she said simply. "Thank you. I just need some time." His voice remained steady, though it dropped slightly on the final word. He appreciated her directness, but signaled his need for solitude with a polite nod. After she left, Richard returned to his workbench. The scene replayed itself. Margaret's voice carrying across the suddenly silent patio, neighbors' frozen expressions, wine glasses halted mid-sip, then Elena's raised eyebrow and challenging response. "Maybe I should double-check that claim myself." Margaret's flash of fury, his own careful dignity as he excused himself, each step measured against the urge to flee. His knees weakened now. He sank onto his leather stool, its familiar creak a counterpoint to his ragged breathing. From the drawer, he pulled their wedding photograph. His finger traced Margaret's younger face, back when her smile reached her eyes without reservation. A tear splashed onto the glass, blurring their faces. Why would she do this? The question burned in his throat. Decades of counseling others through marital crises, and now he sat alone, professional insights useless against this raw pain. His right hand formed a fist, then deliberately relaxed as his counselor's training battled emotion. The pine scent of sawdust mingled with linseed oil as his shoulders shook silently. Outside, night insects began their chorus. In the distance he heard Margaret entering the house alone. He wondered if she regretted her words or was merely angry that her attack had been challenged. The tear on the photograph hadn't dried when he noticed something odd about the frame. A slight warping at one corner, as though it had been recently opened. Richard hadn't touched it in years. His counselor's mind, even in pain, registered the discrepancy. Margaret had accessed their memories recently. Why? He wiped his eyes with his handkerchief, professional curiosity providing momentary refuge from heartache. In the quiet sanctuary of his workshop, surrounded by projects built with patience and care, Richard felt the first stirring of something beyond hurt, a need to understand what had truly happened today. The workshop door, not fully latched after Elena's departure, swung open slightly. Through the gap, He glimpsed Margaret standing in the garden, face unreadable in shadow. Was she coming to apologize, or would her cruelty continue? His breath caught, suspended between hope and dread. Richard awakened with a start, his neck stiff from a night in the workshop recliner. Morning light filtered through the blinds, revealing tools that had witnessed his silent breakdown. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. Why wasn't he in bed? Then Margaret's cruel words rushed back, settling in his chest like a cold stone. He checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Diane, Margaret's sister. No messages from Margaret herself. The time showed 7:32. He'd slept longer than intended, his body demanding recovery from emotional exhaustion. The house greeted him with silence as he entered through the back door. The kitchen stood empty, familiar but somehow altered, like a stage set missing its main actor. A handwritten note lay on the counter. Staying at Diane's for a few days. M. No apology, no explanation, just absence. Richard moved through their morning routine on autopilot, measuring coffee grounds precisely, the familiar rhythm offering momentary comfort. The machine gurgled, releasing a rich aroma that had accompanied 35 years of shared mornings. His gaze fell on Margaret's coffee cup still in the sink from yesterday, lipstick smudge on the rim, unusual for her meticulous habits, little things out of place, like their marriage. "Fine, that's just fine," he said to the empty kitchen, false brightness echoing slightly against the walls. The sound of his own voice startled him. The refrigerator hummed in the stillness. Yesterday's mail remained unopened on the counter, another deviation from routine. Their summer cruise plans smiled mockingly from the calendar photo. Would they still go? Could they? Richard opened the medicine cabinet for aspirin to dull his headache. His hand paused mid-reach at the sight of Margaret's expanding collection. New vitamin supplements, collagen for aging skin, stood beside expensive face creams that hadn't been there last month. When had these appeared? Memory flickered. Margaret lingering before mirrors recently, her critical self-examination when she thought he wasn't watching. The new hair color that had seemed unnecessary to him, but apparently vital to her. Her comments about Elena's youthful appearance, delivered with a brittle smile. His counselor's mind, trained through decades of practice, began connecting dots that his husband's heart hadn't seen. This wasn't about his adequacy at all. The professional part of him recognized the pattern. Insecurity projecting outward, attacking before being attacked. Richard's reflection in the kitchen window caught him by surprise. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper after a night of tears, hair more silver than gray in the morning light. Age had touched them both, but differently. He'd accepted it. She was fighting it. His cell phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting his thoughts. A text from an unknown number. Saw what happened. You deserve better. Coffee at Miller's Cafe at 10. Elena. Richard stared at the message, weighing professional boundaries against the need for perspective. The community dimension of their private pain was something he hadn't fully considered. What else had neighbors witnessed that he'd missed about his own marriage? With a steadying breath, he typed his reply. See you there. Miller's Cafe buzzed with mid-morning activity as Richard pushed through the door. He paused just inside, scanning for familiar faces, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. Would everyone know? Would conversations halt at his approach, resuming in whispers after he passed? He spotted Elena in the corner booth, a deliberate choice, he suspected, offering privacy within the public space. She waved, her expression neither pitying nor overly familiar, just a neighbor acknowledging another. Richard navigated between tables, nodding at acquaintances with practiced composure. Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over offered a smile warmer than usual. Frank Johnson, tending his coffee alone by the window, met his eyes with a subtle nod that felt like solidarity. Perhaps the community landscape had shifted overnight in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I ordered black coffee," Elena said, as he slid into the booth. "Hope that's all right. You struck me as a black coffee kind of man." "Good assessment," Richard replied, grateful for the ordinary exchange. "Thank you." They observed the social niceties for a moment, weather comments, cafe observations, before Elena set down her cup with purpose. Everyone was appalled by Margaret's behavior. She stated matter-of-factly, no preamble. "I thought you should know that." Richard's carefully maintained expression slipped momentarily, surprise and relief flickering across his features before professional composure returned. He'd expected pity, perhaps awkward avoidance, but not this direct acknowledgement. "I appreciate your directness," he said finally, finding unexpected comfort in honesty after months of sensing something wasn't right at home. "I've never seen the point in dancing around difficult truths," Elena replied. Her gold wedding band caught the light as she gestured, a tangible reminder of her widow status. "Not at our age." Richard studied her briefly. Elena had moved to the neighborhood just 3 months ago, after her husband's death. Margaret had initially suggested inviting her for dinner, then mysteriously cooled on the idea after meeting her. "I've noticed something," Elena continued, leaning slightly forward. "Margaret seems uncomfortable around me. At first, I thought it was just the awkwardness people often feel around new widows. Like grief might be contagious." A small, wry smile. "But it's more than that. She checks her appearance whenever I'm around, adjusts her clothes, touches her hair. Not when you're looking, though." The observation clicked something into place. Richard remembered Margaret's recent fixation on looking younger, the hair appointments, new clothes, comments about women our age needing to make more effort. She'd even canceled their usual swimming dates at the community pool, citing sudden self-consciousness. Has she mentioned feeling, I don't know how to put this delicately, concerned about aging? Elena asked. The young mother at a nearby table laughed at something her toddler said, the sound highlighting the age gap between them and most of the cafe's other patrons. Richard's coffee grew cold as he stirred it thoughtfully. "Not directly," he answered, counselor mode engaging despite his personal stake. "But there have been signs I should have recognized sooner." Elena nodded. "My husband went through something similar before he died. Not the public outbursts, but the sudden panic about aging, the fear of becoming invisible." Her direct gaze held no judgment. Sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to see clearly. Richard's hand paused mid-gesture as the connection solidified. Jealousy, aging fears, projection. His professional insights combining with a husband's pain to form a clearer picture. "Frank mentioned people are talking about what happened," Elena said, gathering her purse. "They might address it at the barbecue this weekend." She hesitated. Several people feel something should be said. The idea of community intervention, well-meaning but potentially humiliating for Margaret, added a new dimension to consider. Whatever had driven his wife's behavior, public shaming wouldn't heal it. "Thank you for telling me," Richard said, finding his counselor's voice again. "It gives me more to consider." As they parted outside the cafe, Richard felt a curious lightening. The pain remained, but isolation had been its sharpest edge. In its place, a community context emerged, complex, concerning, but somehow less lonely than before. Richard returned home with renewed purpose, his counselor mindset fully activated. The empty house felt different now, not just a space abandoned by Margaret's absence, but a potential source of answers. He moved through the living room with measured steps, noting small changes that had accumulated over recent months. Fashion magazines on the coffee table where literary journals once sat, television tuned to channels featuring much younger women, a new mirror in the hallway positioned for last-minute checks before leaving the house. In his 30 years as a marriage counselor, he'd guided countless couples through crises sparked by midlife insecurities. How had he missed the signs in his own marriage? Professional detachment was easier with strangers sitting across his office desk, their problems neatly contained within 50-minute sessions. Personal blindness came with painful clarity in retrospect. The home office door stood slightly ajar. Their shared laptop sat on the desk, screen dark, but indicator light showing it remained in sleep mode. Richard hesitated at the threshold, professional ethics warring with personal need. Privacy boundaries had always been sacred in their marriage, respected as both a professional principle and personal value. Exceptional circumstances, he murmured to himself, a justification he'd heard from clients countless times. Now he understood the weight behind those words. The afternoon light slanted through half-closed blinds as he settled into the leather desk chair. It creaked slightly under his weight, the sound accusatory in the silent house. Their wedding photo smiled from the corner of the desk, younger versions of themselves, unaware of the complications age would bring. Richard touched the frame briefly before turning to the laptop. He typed the password with deliberate keystrokes, each one feeling like a boundary crossed. The screen illuminated with Margaret's email still open. She'd left in too much haste to log out, a small mercy that spared him further intrusion. The browser history tab revealed a chronicle of mounting insecurity, signs of aging women over 60, how to appear younger than your age, rejuvenating intimacy after 60, comparing cosmetic procedures before and after. Dozens of searches, increasing in frequency over the past 3 months, coinciding precisely with Elena's arrival in the neighborhood. Richard scrolled carefully, methodically, his counselor's training keeping emotion at bay as he gathered information. A hidden folder labeled Options contained saved before and after cosmetic procedure photos, price lists with certain procedures highlighted. A consultation with Dr. Mercer, a plastic surgeon in the city, scheduled for next month, with a $7,000 deposit already made from their joint account. "Oh, Margaret," he whispered, a mixture of heartache and understanding softening his features. His hand reached toward her empty chair, touching the cardigan she'd left draped over it. The familiar perfume she'd worn for years had been replaced recently with something stronger, younger. Rain began pattering against the window, matching the rhythm of his typing as he delved deeper. An automatically saved document caught his attention, a journal entry Margaret had apparently been writing when interrupted. "Elena makes me feel ancient. She moves like someone half her age, laughs without worrying about lines showing. She looks at Richard differently, not flirtatiously, almost worse, like they share the same generation while I've somehow aged beyond them both. What if he notices the comparison too? What if everyone does? What if they're all thinking it, but not saying it? I can't bear the thought of becoming invisible to him after all these years. The consultation with Dr. Mercer is expensive, but what choice do I have? Richard hasn't touched me in weeks. He says he's tired, but I know what he's really thinking when he looks at me now." Richard's hands trembled as the connections formed completely. His eyes filled with complex tears of empathy mixed with hurt. The journal entry ended there, but its implications continued. He hadn't been distant because of any dissatisfaction with Margaret. He'd been preoccupied with a difficult case, a young couple whose marriage was failing for reasons neither could articulate. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd missed Margaret's signals because he'd never thought them necessary to watch for. In 35 years, he'd never found her anything less than beautiful, the subtle changes of age meaningless against the backdrop of their shared life. But he hadn't told her that, had he? Not recently, perhaps not in years. He'd assumed she knew. Rain patterns cast shadow trails across his face as the realization deepened. Her public humiliation of him hadn't been about his inadequacy at all. It had been a desperate, misguided attempt to reclaim power in a situation where she felt increasingly powerless. Attacking before being abandoned. A calendar notification popped up on screen. Neighborhood barbecue Sunday, 4 p.m. The setting for potential community confrontation now carried new weight of understanding. What would happen if well-meaning neighbors intervened without knowing the vulnerable fear driving Margaret's behavior? The public shaming would only confirm her worst fears about how others saw her. Richard closed the laptop slowly, professional insight and husband's heart finding common ground in compassion. The betrayal still stung. Public humiliation wasn't justified by private insecurity, but understanding transformed his path forward. This wasn't about forgiveness yet, but about addressing the real problem rather than its symptom. He would need to set boundaries about respect while acknowledging her fears. The counselor in him knew the approach. The husband in him dreaded the conversation. But as the rain continued its steady rhythm against the window, Richard began to form a plan that might save both their dignity. Richard heard Margaret's car in the driveway and took a deep breath, centering himself. He'd rehearsed this conversation mentally, drawing on decades of professional experience. Start with observation, not accusation. Address the underlying fear rather than the symptom. Establish boundaries while offering understanding. Simple principles that felt anything but simple now that they were personal. He prepared tea, Margaret's favorite chamomile, arranging cups on the kitchen table. A neutral space, neither his territory nor hers. The kettle whistled as the front door opened. Margaret entered cautiously, overnight bag clutched like a shield. Her shoulders were hunched defensively, chin jutting slightly forward. Body language he'd noted in countless therapy sessions with clients preparing for confrontation. Her makeup was heavier than usual, hair freshly styled, despite her supposed retreat to her sister's home. "You're back," Richard said simply, pouring hot water into the teapot. "Just to get more clothes." Her eyes darted around the kitchen, assessing. "I'm staying with Diane a few more days." Richard gestured to the table. "Could we talk first?" "Just for a few minutes." Wariness crossed her features, but she set down her bag and took a seat, perched on the edge of the chair as if prepared for quick departure. The afternoon light cast harsh shadows between them, kitchen photographs of happier times witnessing their current discord from the refrigerator door. "I think I understand what's happening," Richard began carefully. "And it's not what you think." Margaret's defenses visibly heightened. "Spending time with Elena already. That didn't take long." The accusation stung with its unfairness, but Richard recognized the fear beneath it. "Elena stopped by to check if I was all right," he said evenly. "And yes, we had coffee this morning at Miller's Cafe very publicly, discussing what happened." I'm sure she had plenty to say. Margaret's fingers tightened around her untouched teacup. Richard took a measured breath. "This isn't about my adequacy, is it?" he asked gently. "It's about your fears of aging. About feeling invisible or less valuable somehow." Margaret's eyes flashed panic before hardening, her knuckles whitening around the cup. "Don't psychoanalyze me. You're not my therapist." Her voice rose sharply. "Just because you counsel other people's marriages doesn't mean you understand ours." "I'm concerned about you," Richard offered genuinely, extending his hand halfway across the table. Margaret pulled back slightly, and he let his hand retreat. "I saw the consultation appointment with Dr. Mercer." The color drained from Margaret's face. "You went through my things? My computer?" "After what happened, I needed to understand." "So you invaded my privacy?" She stood abruptly, tea sloshing over the cup's edge. "That's a violation of trust. How dare you use your counseling tactics on me?" Richard maintained his deliberate breathing, counting silently as he'd taught so many clients to do in moments of high emotion. "Margaret, spending $7,000 from our joint account without discussion was also a violation of trust. It's my face, my body." Her voice trembled now. "You haven't even noticed what's happening to me. You haven't touched me, haven't really looked at me in months." "That's not true," Richard said quietly. "I've been preoccupied with the Jenkins case, yes, but never—" "You don't get to decide how I feel." Margaret's voice cracked. "You don't get to sit there calm and rational while I'm falling apart. It's easy for you. Men get distinguished, women get old." The kettle continued whistling, ignored as tension built between them. Margaret's new perfume seemed too strong in the confined space, as if trying to fill gaps words couldn't bridge. Outside, neighborhood children played, their laughter a painful counterpoint to the silence that followed her outburst. "I think," Richard said finally, maintaining his professional tone through great effort, "we need to consider counseling. Not with me, obviously. With someone who can help us both understand." "I don't need counseling. I need a husband who sees me." Margaret grabbed her overnight bag. "Maybe I made a mistake the other night. Or maybe I just finally said what I've been thinking for months." The barb landed precisely where intended. Richard felt color rise in his face despite his determination to remain calm. "What happened the other night was cruel and disrespectful, regardless of what's driving it. We've been married 35 years. We owe each other better than public humiliation." "Respect?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call it, when you withdraw into your work and leave me alone with a mirror that shows me disappearing a little more each day? When you spend more time helping strangers than noticing your own wife?" Before Richard could respond, she turned and walked out, footsteps sharp against the hardwood floor. The bedroom door slammed moments later, its echo reverberating through the house. Richard flinched slightly at the sound, hand rising involuntarily, as if to protect his face from the emotional blow. He remained at the kitchen table, the untouched tea cooling between them. All his professional knowledge seemed suddenly theoretical, academic principles crumbling against the messy reality of human fear and pride. How many couples had sat in his office, wounds similarly exposed, while he offered insights that seemed so clear from the outside? Through the kitchen window, Richard spotted elderly neighbor Frank watching from his garden, pruning shears in hand. Their eyes met briefly, and Frank offered a sympathetic nod, first concrete evidence that the community's awareness extended beyond Elena. The neighborhood was watching their pain unfold, silent witnesses to a drama they'd likely discuss among themselves. Richard heard Margaret moving upstairs, drawers opening and closing forcefully, more clothes being packed, more distance being created. He slid slowly down the hallway wall to a sitting position after she retreated upstairs, head in his hands. For all his training in emotional regulation, tears of frustration stung his eyes. The professional detachment he'd maintained during their conversation finally crumbled in solitude. The most painful realization wasn't Margaret's rejection of his understanding. It was recognizing that understanding itself wasn't enough. Knowledge without connection couldn't heal. In 30 years of counseling, he'd never felt the limitation of his profession quite so personally. Has someone's insecurity ever lashed out and wounded you deeply? Share below if you felt the sting of public humiliation, like if you believe in responding with dignity rather than retaliation, and follow to see how Richard navigates this heartbreaking rejection. Richard remained seated on the hallway floor until he heard Margaret descend the stairs, overnight bag now bulging with additional clothes. She paused briefly at the front door, perhaps waiting for him to emerge, then left without another word. The sound of her car starting, then fading down the street, left a vacuum of silence in its wake. His professional training offered no comfort now. 30 years of guiding others through marital crises, and he sat alone on his floor, unable to bridge the gap in his own marriage. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so painful. Richard pushed himself up, muscles stiff from tension. The kitchen held no appeal with its scene of failed reconciliation, so he stepped outside instead. The garden had always been a shared project, each plant representing some anniversary or milestone. Now it felt like a memorial to something slipping away. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across neatly trimmed beds. Margaret's roses bloomed along the fence line, pink varieties she'd selected for their resilience to Michigan winters. Appropriate, he thought ruefully. They'd weathered 35 years together, through career changes, parent deaths, their son's difficult divorce. Was this to be their breaking point? A crisis of aging neither had anticipated. "Afternoon, Richard." Frank Johnson stood on the other side of the fence, pruning shears in weathered hands. Their neighbor of 20 years continued snipping methodically at his own rose bushes, not making direct eye contact, a characteristically male approach to sensitive conversation. "Frank," Richard acknowledged, unsure whether to initiate further discussion or retreat into privacy. "Garden's looking good this year," Frank commented, examining a rose stem with exaggerated interest. "Margaret's touch, I expect. She always had a way with those English varieties." "She does," Richard agreed, grateful for the neutral opening. The sprinkler system activated in the yard beyond Frank's, creating a momentary rainbow in the late afternoon light. Children's voices carried from several houses down, their play a reminder of life continuing normally elsewhere. Frank snipped another stem before speaking again. "Margaret had no call to speak to you that way," he stated plainly, continuing his pruning without looking up. "Not after all these years." Richard's carefully maintained composure wavered at the unexpected support. He'd prepared for awkward avoidance from neighbors, perhaps even subtle judgment. Frank's straightforward acknowledgement caught him off guard. "These things are complicated," Richard offered, professional habit deflecting personal pain. "Not that complicated." Frank finally looked up, weathered face serious. "We've all been married long enough to know better. There are things you don't say in public, no matter what's going on at home." Richard nodded, throat suddenly tight. "Janet and I had our rough patches," Frank continued, mentioning his wife of 47 years, who had passed 3 summers ago. "Times I slept in the garage, times she threatened to move to her sister's. Never once did either of us take it outside these fences." He gestured with his shears to indicate the neighborhood boundaries. A chickadee landed on the fence between them, inspecting both men briefly before flitting away. The rhythmic snipping of Frank's pruning provided a soundtrack to their conversation, making the difficult exchange somehow easier. "The ladies have been talking," Frank added, returning to his roses. "Beth Henderson, the Wilsons, they're concerned." "About Margaret?" Richard asked. "About both of you." Frank set down his shears, giving Richard his full attention now. "Look, I'm not one for gossip, but you should know people are discussing what happened at Sunday's barbecue. Several feel something needs to be said." The community dimension of their private pain expanded in Richard's mind. What had seemed a humiliating but isolated incident was becoming a neighborhood concern. The social fabric they'd been part of for decades was responding to the tear in its pattern. "Elena mentioned something similar," Richard admitted. Frank nodded. "She's direct, that one. Reminds me of Janet." A brief smile crossed his face. Margaret's behavior surprised everyone. It wasn't like her. "No," Richard agreed. "It wasn't. Whatever's troubling her, it doesn't excuse public disrespect." Frank's tone held the certainty of long-held values. "In my day, we respected our spouses, especially in public." The simple statement carried decades of community standards, unwritten rules about how marriages functioned within the social context. Richard felt a curious lightening of his burden. The judgment he'd feared wasn't directed at him at all, but at behavior that violated shared values. "I appreciate your directness," Richard said, echoing his earlier words to Elena. Their conversation ended with a simple nod between men, words unnecessary. The pruning shears resumed their rhythmic snipping as Richard turned back toward his house. Through an upstairs window, he caught a glimpse of movement, a neighbor watching their exchange. The community's awareness was both comforting and concerning. Support for him meant potential isolation for Margaret, which would only worsen her insecurities. Inside, Richard straightened his shoulders with new resolve. The tears of frustration had dried, replaced by strategic clarity. His training might have failed in the immediate confrontation with Margaret, but it gave him perspective now. Her behavior stemmed from fear, irrational perhaps, but real to her. The community's response, while validating for him, could deepen her sense of isolation if handled poorly. As a counselor, he'd often told clients that relationship healing required both parties' participation. As a husband, he'd held hope Margaret would recognize her behavior and reach out. Now a third path emerged, one that acknowledged her vulnerability without accepting her disrespect, that used community standards as framework rather than weapon. From the living room window, he watched Frank continue his careful pruning, each cut deliberate and purposeful. Sometimes growth required selective trimming of what didn't belong. Boundaries, not walls. Clarity, not capitulation. Richard moved to his desk, professional purpose returning. The barbecue this weekend would happen with or without his input. Better to shape the conversation than allow it to develop unchecked. Margaret's dignity and their marriage deserved that much consideration, despite her hurtful actions. Through the study window, he noticed Margaret watching from her car parked down the street, her expression unreadable at this distance. Had she returned to apologize, or to gather more belongings? Was she recognizing consequences, or planning counter-moves? Whatever her purpose, her presence suggested the conversation wasn't finished, merely paused. For the first time since her public humiliation, Richard felt something beyond hurt and confusion. A quiet determination took its place, not to win or punish, but to address the real issue with the wisdom his profession had taught him, and the love 35 years had built. The path forward remained unclear, but at least now he stood on solid ground. Richard's phone rang early Friday morning. Diane's name flashed on the screen, the first direct contact from Margaret's sister since the incident. He answered with professional composure, unsure whether to expect hostility or conciliation. "I'm coming over," Diane announced without preamble. "Margaret doesn't know I'm calling. I'll be there in an hour." Before Richard could respond, she disconnected. He set the phone down carefully, touching his wedding ring briefly before rising to prepare for this unexpected development. Family dynamics were entering the equation now, adding another layer to an already complex situation. The house felt emptier than it had yesterday, Margaret's absence settling into corners and hallways. Richard showered and dressed with deliberate care, choosing a blue button-down she'd once said brought out his eyes. Armor of a different sort. Diane arrived precisely as promised, her compact car pulling into the driveway with characteristic efficiency. Margaret's younger sister had always been the practical one, an accountant who approached emotional matters with the same precision she applied to financial statements. "You look terrible," she announced as Richard opened the door. Her bird-like movements were more pronounced than usual, head tilting as she assessed him. "Has she called you at all?" "No," Richard admitted, leading her to the kitchen. "Coffee?" "Please." Diane settled at the table, placing her purse precisely beside her chair. "She's been acting strange for months. I'm worried about her." Richard prepared the coffee in silence, processing this confirmation of his timeline. "When did you first notice?" "January, maybe February." Diane accepted the mug with a nod of thanks. After Elena moved into the Patterson house, Margaret kept making odd comments about women who try too hard to look young while simultaneously scheduling hair appointments every 3 weeks instead of her usual 6. "I discovered she has a consultation with a plastic surgeon next month," Richard said, watching carefully for Diane's reaction. "I know." No surprise registered on her face. "She told me she was using her inheritance from Mom, but I suspected she hadn't mentioned it to you." She sipped her coffee. "That's not like the Margaret I know. We've always been straightforward about finances in our family." Richard shared his discoveries about Margaret's insecurities, the browser history, the journal entry. Diane listened without interruption, the accountant gathering all facts before forming conclusions. "The barbecue is Sunday," she said finally. "Margaret's pretending it's not happening, but we both know the neighborhood. Someone will say something." "I've been considering how to approach that," Richard admitted. An envelope arrived through the mail slot as they spoke, the formal barbecue invitation they received each year, though traditionally delivered in person. The changed protocol spoke volumes about the community's uncertainty regarding their situation. Margaret returned home that afternoon, visibly startled to find her sister at the kitchen table with Richard. Her defenses rose immediately, suspicion clouding her features. "What's this? Family intervention?" The brittleness in her voice couldn't quite mask the vulnerability beneath. "I came to check on both of you," Diane said simply. "That's what family does." Margaret's overnight bag landed heavily by the door. "I suppose Richard has been sharing his theories about my mental state." "We've been discussing Sunday's barbecue," Richard replied evenly. "The invitation came." "I'm not going." Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "And neither should you." "Running away won't help," Diane interjected, her direct approach unchanged by tension. "People are talking, Mags. Better to face it together than hide and let rumors grow." "Easy for you to say," Margaret snapped. "You're not the one they're judging." The three settled into an uneasy conversation, more circular than productive. Margaret refused to acknowledge any underlying issue beyond Richard's perceived inattentiveness. Diane's attempts at sisterly straight talk met defensive deflection. Richard maintained his counselor's patience, recognizing that pressed corners rarely yield openings. By evening, only one point had been agreed upon. They would attend Sunday's barbecue together, presenting a unified front, whatever their private reality. Margaret retreated upstairs to begin preparations, the sound of closet doors opening and closing suggesting extensive wardrobe consideration. Richard found himself alone with Diane in the kitchen once more. "She's terrified," Diane said quietly. "I've never seen her like this, not even when Dad died." "I know," Richard replied, "but fear doesn't justify cruelty." "No," Diane agreed, gathering her purse. "It doesn't, but understanding it might help navigate what comes next." After Diane departed, Richard spent the evening reviewing mental strategies for Sunday's gathering. His professional training offered frameworks for conflict management in group settings, but theory felt thin against the emotional weight of potential public confrontation. Saturday passed in preparation mode. Margaret moved through the house like a visitor, carefully maintaining physical distance while selecting outfits, discarding choices, trying combinations. Richard observed her nervous energy with professional detachment layered over husband's concern. Her makeup session Sunday morning lasted nearly 2 hours, each layer of foundation a shield against anticipated judgment. Richard chose his own clothing with deliberate care that morning, touching his wedding ring briefly before straightening his tie. In the mirror's reflection, he caught Diane watching from the guest room doorway, her concern evident. "This won't be easy," she said simply. "No," Richard agreed, "but necessary." As they prepared to leave, Richard took a final moment alone, shoulders squaring with resolve. Whatever happened at the barbecue would shape their path forward, either healing their marriage or revealing its irreparable fractures. The counselor in him recognized the crisis point. The husband felt its weight in his chest, standing at the crossroads of confrontation and compassion. Comment your strategy for handling public humiliation, like if you believe wisdom comes from setting boundaries with love, and follow to witness how a community responds to broken trust. The Johnsons' backyard transformed each summer into the neighborhood's gathering hub. Today, string lights hung from pergola to fence, creating the same warm glow that had illuminated Margaret's cruel words the previous weekend. Richard felt the echo of that moment as they approached, Margaret's hand tense in the crook of his arm. "We can still leave," she whispered, pace slowing. "Running won't solve this," Richard replied quietly. "Whatever happens, we face it with dignity." Diane walked slightly ahead, her presence both buffer and witness. As they rounded the corner, conversations paused momentarily, a ripple of awareness passing through the gathering. Then, with practiced social grace, neighbors resumed their discussions, voices perhaps a touch too bright. Frank approached first, weathered hand extending to Richard. "Good to see you both," he said, nodding to Margaret with polite reserve. The greeting set the tone, civil inclusion without pretending nothing had happened. Margaret clung to Richard's arm, her smile fixed and brittle. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Her voice carried a forced lightness that fooled no one. They moved through the gathering, accepting plates of food neither felt inclined to eat. Conversation flowed around them in careful streams, avoiding the rocks of recent events. Margaret's knuckles remained white around her wineglass, eyes darting between faces for signs of judgment. Richard spotted Elena's arrival, silver earrings catching light as she entered, her simple elegance unforced. Margaret's fingers tightened painfully on his arm. "I need to use the restroom," she murmured, retreating toward the house. In her absence, several neighbors drifted toward Richard, offering subtle support through ordinary conversation. Beth Henderson mentioned his helpful advice years ago during her son's difficult phase. The Wilsons recalled his volunteer work at the community center, small reminders of his standing deliberately voiced. Margaret returned as dessert was served, her makeup freshly applied. The gathering had settled into the comfortable rhythm of long-established connections. Laughter at familiar jokes, friendly disagreements over perennial topics. Perhaps they would navigate this evening without incident after all. Then Elena set down her dessert plate with deliberate movement and stood. "I need to address what happened at our last gathering," she began, voice clear in the sudden quiet. Richard felt Margaret freeze beside him. Across the yard, Diane straightened, attention focused. "I'm relatively new here," Elena continued, "but I understand this community values honesty and respect." Her silver earrings caught the light as she looked directly at Margaret. What happened last weekend violated both. Neighbors' heads nodded in slight, unified movement, a visual wave of agreement crossing the gathering. No one spoke, but the consensus was unmistakable. "Marriages face challenges," Elena acknowledged. "We all know that, but public humiliation is never acceptable, especially after decades together." Her tone held no accusation, just quiet authority. Respect is foundational in relationships. Without it, what remains? The question hung in the evening air. Richard felt Margaret's hand trembling against his arm, her breathing shallow. He considered intervening, but recognized this community reckoning had its own necessary momentum. "I've known Margaret and Richard for 20 years, Beth Henderson added, her usual shyness overcome by conviction. "They've been examples to many of us, which is why last week was so unexpected." Margaret's face began to crumble, defiance giving way to realization as unified judgment registered. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush rising from her neck, the slight quiver in her lower lip. "My sister has been struggling." Diane's voice surprised everyone as she stepped forward. "That doesn't excuse her behavior, but context matters." The statement hung between family loyalty and truth, Diane acknowledging Margaret's fault while offering the beginning of explanation. Her stance beside Elena rather than Margaret spoke volumes about where justice lay, even in sisterhood. "I think," Frank said into the weighted silence, "that in our community we hold certain standards. Not because we're perfect. Lord knows we've all had our moments, but because respect matters more the longer you've been together." Margaret's hand slipped from Richard's arm. He turned to find her eyes filled with tears, the shame he'd anticipated now fully present. But beneath it, something unexpected, relief. As if the public naming of her transgression offered release from the tension of pretending. "I'd like to say something," Margaret said quietly, voice steadier than Richard expected. The gathering's attention shifted, expressions guarded, but not closed. Richard felt a surge of professional admiration for this community's balance of accountability and grace. They weren't seeking to destroy, but to restore order. "What I did was inexcusable," Margaret began, eyes fixed on her hands. "Richard deserves better after 35 years. She paused, gathering composure. "I've been struggling with personal issues, but that's no justification for public cruelty." The simple acknowledgment shifted the atmosphere subtly. Not forgiveness yet, but the prerequisite for it. Richard noticed several women's expressions softening slightly, perhaps recognizing something in Margaret's vulnerability that resonated with their own unspoken fears. "I think," Elena said after a moment, "that's a good beginning." The gathering gradually resumed its normal patterns, though conversations remained more subdued. Margaret stayed beside Richard, no longer clinging but present, occasionally meeting a neighbor's eyes with quiet acknowledgement rather than defensive avoidance. As the evening wound down, Richard observed the shifting social landscape with professional interest layered over personal investment. The community had expressed its values without demolishing Margaret's standing within it. They'd created space for redemption while maintaining boundaries, a delicate balance his counseling practice had always strived to achieve. Walking home between Richard and Diane, Margaret seemed both diminished and unburdened. The public reckoning had accomplished what private confrontation couldn't, breaking through layers of denial to the vulnerable truth beneath. What remained to be seen was whether that broken ground could nurture something new or simply mark the end of what had been. Richard and Margaret returned home in silence, the space between them on the sofa palpable as they settled in the living room. Diane had tactfully retreated upstairs, giving them privacy while remaining available should the delicate peace fracture. The evening's public reckoning hung in the air, not resolved, but clarified in ways private confrontation hadn't achieved. "Would you like some tea?" Richard offered, professional habit of creating comfortable space for difficult conversations. Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." Her voice sounded tired, but clearer than it had in weeks, the brittle defensiveness gone. She rose slowly and moved to the bookshelf, hands trembling slightly as she retrieved their wedding album. Richard watched, saying nothing, as she returned to the sofa. The leather-bound album held 35 years of shared history, birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, ordinary moments preserved. Margaret placed it between them, a physical bridge across emotional distance. "I was so afraid of losing you that I pushed you away," she said finally, voice breaking on the confession. The first tear fell as she opened to the first page, landing on their younger selves, bright with hope and certainty. "It sounds ridiculous when I say it aloud." "Fear rarely makes logical sense," Richard replied, counselor's insight softened by husband's empathy. Margaret turned pages slowly, tracing their journey through decades. "I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't recognize myself. When Elena moved in, so vibrant, so comfortable in her skin, I saw you talking with her at the mailbox. You were laughing in a way you hadn't with me in months." "I was distracted by the Jenkins case," Richard acknowledged. "But that was about work, Margaret, never about you." "I know that now." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "But fear isn't rational. I started seeing threats everywhere, confirmation of what I feared most, becoming invisible to you." Richard considered his response carefully. The betrayal still stung. Public humiliation wasn't justified by private insecurity, but understanding transformed his approach. "What you did at the gathering was cruel," he said finally, voice firm but not unkind. "We've built a life on mutual respect. That can't happen again." "I know." Margaret met his eyes directly for the first time in weeks. "I was cruel because I'm terrified," she admitted, the words costing visible effort. "Not of you, but of disappearing, of becoming someone's burden rather than desire." The vulnerability in her confession touched something deep in Richard. How many couples had sat in his office, unable to bridge this precise gap, the courage to voice deepest fears? "I've been seeing Dr. Winters," Margaret said unexpectedly, "a therapist specializing in aging issues." "For 3 weeks now." Richard couldn't hide his surprise. "You've been in therapy?" "I made the first appointment after the mirror incident," she explained. "Before everything else, Diane drove me while staying at her house. It's helping, I think." A small, rueful smile touched her lips. "At least, it was before I sabotaged everything." This revelation shifted Richard's understanding yet again. Margaret's journey toward change had begun before the public confrontation. before his investigation. She'd recognized her struggle and sought help independently, a strength he hadn't credited her with in recent weeks. "Nothing's been sabotaged beyond repair," he said carefully. "But we need boundaries going forward. Complete honesty about finances. No public disrespect, ever. And perhaps," he hesitated, "perhaps couples counseling alongside your individual work." Margaret nodded, fingers brushing the edge of a photograph showing them on their 25th anniversary. "I'd like that." She hesitated. "The consultation with Dr. Mercer, I've canceled it. It was panic, not decision." They sat in new understanding, not touching, but facing each other directly for the first time in weeks. The wedding album between them held both their past and, potentially, their future, not unchanged, but perhaps strengthened through crisis. "Elena's husband died of cancer last year," Margaret said unexpectedly. "Did you know? She told me at the barbecue tonight. Said she'd give anything for another day with him, wrinkles and all." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Made me realize what I've been risking." Outside, crickets chirped in the summer evening. Through the window, lights from neighboring homes glowed warmly, the community continuing its rhythms around them. The clock that had witnessed their 35 years together ticked steadily on the mantel, marking passage into this new chapter. "We should thank Diane for coming," Richard said, not quite ready to close the moment but sensing its natural conclusion. "Tomorrow," Margaret agreed, carefully closing the album. "She's probably pretending to sleep while listening for breaking dishes." The small joke, their first shared moment of lightness in weeks, hung between them like a tentative offering. Richard's lips curved slightly in response. "One day at a time," he said, the phrase he'd offered countless couples now applying to his own marriage. Margaret nodded, rising with the wedding album. She returned it to the shelf, fingers lingering briefly on its spine. Past preserved, future uncertain, but possible. When she turned back, her expression held something Richard hadn't seen in months, quiet determination rather than fear. They moved through evening routines separately, but aware of each other, the distance between them no longer charged with hostility. As Richard prepared for bed, he caught sight of his reflection, the lines around his eyes, silver hair at his temples, evidence of a life fully lived. For the first time since Margaret's public words, he felt the fullness of his years as strength rather than liability. Their marriage had weathered its most serious storm. The damage remained visible in certain angles of conversation, in careful distances still maintained. But as Richard turned out his light, he recognized that dignity had been restored, not through perfect resolution, but through honest acknowledgement of both hurt and hope. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it with the wisdom that only comes from weathering life's hardest truths together. We've all stood where Richard stood, haven't we? In that moment when someone we love says words that can't be unsaid in a place where others can hear. That public wound cuts deeper than any private disagreement, especially after decades of building something together. The shame burns hotter than the anger at first. Your cheeks flame while your heart freezes, and somehow you have to keep standing there, chin up, even as everything inside crumbles. Ain't it something how dignity becomes most precious when it's threatened? In your 60s, after building a life, a reputation, a place in your community, that standing matters. You've earned it through years of showing up, being reliable, handling your business with integrity. Then suddenly, it can all feel paper thin, torn by a single careless moment. The workshop where Richard retreated, we all have those sanctuaries, don't we? That spare room with your books, the garden shed with your tools, the kitchen at 5 a.m., when everyone else sleeps. Places where tears can fall without witnesses. The hardest part isn't the hurt itself, but understanding it. Margaret's fear of aging, of becoming invisible. Ladies, you've felt that cold shadow, haven't you? Gentlemen, maybe you've known that fear of relevance slipping away. We carry these vulnerabilities close, rarely speaking them aloud, until sometimes they burst out sideways, hurting those we meant to keep closest. The courage Richard found wasn't in fighting back, but in seeking to understand first. That's wisdom earned through living long enough to know that most battles aren't what they first appear. What I admire most about Richard's journey is how he maintained his principles while keeping his heart open. Setting boundaries isn't about building walls. It's about defining the terms of love. After 60, we've learned that lesson the hard way, through marriages weathered or lost, through friendships tested by time. We know that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that real strength shows in the ability to say, "I love you, but this behavior must change." When the evening crickets sing and the porch swing creaks beneath you, there's a peace in knowing you've faced your hardest truths with grace. Your hair may be silver, your hands may bear the marks of years, but your dignity, that's something no one can take unless you surrender it. And the wisdom to know the difference between pride and self-respect. That's the gift of our years, folks. That's the treasure worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth tears and reconciliation, and the hard, beautiful work of beginning again.